Hello and welcome to Propaganda Loves You. This will be our second deep dive of the year. This one going into a review of Adam Curtis's A Century of the Self documentary, four-part documentary available on YouTube, which we'll keep in the show notes for this recording. This is a follow-on from our brief discussion about Edward Bernays on our Tuesday episode, and this is part one, and we'll bring you part two next Thursday. So here's part one.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So yeah, let's just dive in. So let's start big. We watched the first two episodes. That's kind of what we're gonna chat about here. But what was your guys' big takeaways? I think like before we get into, you guys can get into like the message and stuff first, but I just wanted to say like I just really liked the aesthetic and the filming. I felt like I was watching, I don't know what it was. It kept me really entertained into that. It might throw some people off when you're reading it because it kind of jumps around a lot, and I don't know if it's not like a doom and gloom kind of aesthetic, but there's like an undertone of like, not evil. There's a undertone feeling throughout the entire thing. I think when I'm watching it, that's just like, it makes you almost feel uneasy a little bit. Did you guys feel that way when you were watching it as well? I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there were definitely parts that made me feel uneasy. I think like my biggest takeaway from it, one was the social signaling, like virtue signaling that consumption, I guess, like inherently was engineered to become. And it made me think about, it's like people are only buying what they need. Well, let's make them need, here we are in beyond 40-hour work weeks and we're all tired and, whatever. It's like it's manufactured to a degree to keep people, chained within their constraints that, work well for you to be in the capitalism wheel. But two was like the specific one about soap really got to me, and I started thinking about it, and I thought about like how there's like active campaigns to use products that are outside their original intent. And I saw one lately for like Rice Krispie treats where kids were building like big blocks, like almost like Lego blocks or whatever. And I was like, who's got the money? Like, you're encouraging me to just waste this food. And I'm like, oh, that's actually great because now I need to go buy 30 boxes of Rice Krispie treats, and that's what they want. So it's like definitely the through line exists today in everything.
I agree with the sinister aesthetic. I think that's a good choice on the filmmaker's part because it gives you the sense that, I don't know, and I kind of feel like maybe this is why I try to teach the Howard Zinn history so often too, is because we get a certain surface level understanding of a timeline of events. Like we get educated, we become adults, and we feel like in that process of becoming an adult, through our education, through our social environments, through just having conversations, that we've acquired a certain baseline of knowledge where we feel like we understand what happened in history, at least recent history. We feel like we know about the 20th century, we know about World War I and World War II, the big bombs, the Cold War. We feel like we have some basic level understanding. But then something like Howard Zinn's book or something like this documentary comes back and retells you the same story, but it gives you another layer of what's going on, of the motivations of the people in charge, of the oppression that was overlooked in the story that you got, of all these other aspects of that same history that you felt like you knew. So it's taking something that's been familiar to you and it's defamiliarizing that familiar thing for you. It's taking this familiar thing and all of a sudden making it creepy and weird and new. And it's like, oh, what is this history that I thought I knew? And now it's this new light and I feel uneasy about it. And I think part of that uneasiness comes from the awareness that we have been manipulated, that we ourselves are not above being manipulated. And I think to your point, Arthur, too, with the Rice Krispie example, like you can just re-look at all these other things that have gone on in 20th century history and even in the 21st century, and you can see this new aspect of it in these things. And I'm thinking of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which was a big deal. in like the 60s or 70s when it came out. But basically, after World War II, there were all these petrochemical companies and manufacturers that had produced bombs and weapons and things used for war. They have all this product. They can't move now because the war is over. So how can we put these products to new use? Pesticides, right? These things are great at killing bugs. So let's just convince everyone who's growing food, first of all, to spray these pesticides on everything. And then the rise of the American lawn after World War II. We didn't really have a suburban culture before World War II. We had the city and we had farm life. And those were like big separations. After World War II, the interstate system got built out in the country. And that interstate system that got built out allowed us to have these suburban communities with tiny little boxes and small half-acre plots and all this stuff. And there's no point to have a lawn, but it reminds you of this big open field that farmers like to have, right? And so there's this aesthetic that you feel fulfilled when you have a nice, clean, green lawn. In order to keep it clean and green and beautiful, you need all these chemicals to spray on it and keep the bugs off. And so it just creates this consumption wheel like we've been talking about. But you can just see that through line when you go back and look at this history that we thought we were familiar with. And it makes my stomach turn too.
Those are great examples. I love that whole historical setting. Really nice.
Yeah, and just tying like back into that, I think it was Arthur what you were saying, like the shift. The quote that I pulled out, it was I can't remember exactly the time, but it was like a Paul Mazur from the Lehman Brothers had this quote that they read out, which was, "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want a new thing even before the old has been consumed. Man's desire must overshadow his needs." Someone spent the time to write that shit down, like in that position, like literally spelling out like what they wanted to do in order to continue to drive. And Joe, that I think that was right after that was talking about the war economy, right? Like how do we continue with this? How do we take all this production that we're doing and how do we continue to sell it, right? They were worried about like stalling out. There was an old show on like Nickelodeon where I think someone started buying these watches to sell, but they were marketed as like these indestructible watches, right? So it basically became this problem where he had to buy like a certain amount. Then everyone had these watches. Then, oh my gosh, everyone's got an indestructible watch. I can't sell all these watches. It's like that like thought process that the people had. Like, well, if we make all these, cars that are indestructible and last forever, then how do we keep making money? Yeah, it goes into this just cycle.
Planned obsolescence.
Yeah.
Yeah, iPhones. Like, come on. All my Apple products, like, well, whatever. Terrible tangent. But yes, planned obsolescence. France outlawed that stuff. That's really good.
I don't know how much we want to go down this, but I was just kind of thinking about Bernays' connection to Freud and how the Freudian psychoanalytic method it's a model for understanding the mind. Like a lot of people shit on Freud for good or bad reasons. There are plenty of good and bad reasons to shit on Freud. He wasn't a perfect person, but his model is like a way to try to understand consciousness, a way to try to understand the mind. People are like, oh, it's been debunked because we opened up a brain and we didn't find an ego and a superego in there. And it's like, that's not really how it works. It's just a model for understanding the phenomena of the mind. But the purpose of doing that was, you could say, compassionate, right? A therapeutic intention. I want to work with patients in a way to help them have greater access to their unconscious desires so that they can process these traumas and past feelings and develop themselves psychologically to become healthier, more well-adjusted adults in the modern world. And so there's like a compassionate intention there, and then you add the element of we need surplus value, we need profit, we need to grow, and the perspective of you could say, I kind of want to get at this question of perspective. What is the point of view of the therapist, like Freud, who's one-on-one with the client, or the point of view of the propagandist, like Bernays, who is thinking about himself as a broadcaster to the whole general public? Those two different shifts in perspective. And I kind of feel like that shift in thinking that I have to put myself in the position of figuring out how to manipulate mass media for everyone Like, what kind of, first of all, assumption of the ego does it take to assume that position of like, I can manipulate the masses? That point of view in and of itself is something we could talk about. But I think when you put on that point of view and realize the power you can gain by manipulating the masses, that's when we get into this, all these, I don't know, ploys to sell shit, right? One of the different models, I guess, psychoanalysis is intended to make people happier. Public relations or propaganda, which are synonymous terms, it turns out, is intended to sell shit or manipulate people into behaving in a certain way.
Yeah, I think the there was another quote there that comes back to that for me, which is when they talk about how Bernays thought about people, right? Like I think his daughter Anna was talking about how like stupid or dumb, like that would come up all the time. He'd always think that people are dumb, stupid. And he didn't think about people like people. He thought in groups of like 1,000, which I thought was super illuminating, right? Like that he doesn't like almost consider himself to be at the same like echelon. He definitely considers himself to be one of the elite that should be driving civilization, and that everyone else is cattle and needs to be herded with blinders, like literal cattle.
Yeah, and I just feel like we still see that same perspective problem in the people we talk about today. Like Epstein was kind of like that, right? He kind of viewed the world and world leaders really as stupid people that he could manipulate in various ways. And I don't know, that kind of perspective, if you get locked into it and you think, you're fucking God returned or whatever, you think you have a right to that kind of manipulation over the masses, you're dealing with a dangerous person, a person who regularly inhabits that point of view.
Yeah, definitely. They'll like dissociate people and gamify life and kill tens of thousands at a whim.
So like on that same topic, I think there was the quote from, Walter Lippmann in there that was talking about believed in the mob in the street not being driven by logic. It was talking about the birth of psychoanalysis, I think, in that scenario. And what I was just trying to think about, like, or as it's talking about psychoanalysis and how they used it to try and think about mob logic and how to control, large populations, it made me like, I would love to know more from somebody that's really deep in the field, in the history of the field of psychoanalysis. Cause like, is that why it started? Like, and then like evolved to the point where you've got people that are trying to help, like psychologists or normal psychologists or something, that are just trying to help people with problems. Like, are these two completely different fields, right? Like I think that's the thing I don't understand. Or did psychoanalysis lead to the birth of like what we think of as psychotherapy today? Like when we think of therapy, like, are these very different fields? Does that make sense?
No, I think it's a direct line. Yeah, I think the psychoanalytic school, like Freud's cohort, and he had, a bunch of students. Carl Jung was one of his students. That whole group of people in Europe in like the late 1800s sort of founded the field of what we think of today as modern psychotherapy, talk therapy, sitting down with a clinician one-on-one, talking about your issues and working out. And there are a bunch of different techniques that have been developed since then. And that's how you get into all the different fields and subfields of psychotherapy now, like dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, internal family systems. They're all different kinds of models people use now. And Freud's model was just kind of the model that got all of these models started, and everybody's kind of adapted it in their own way. But I do think as a professional field, yeah, it starts basically with Freud. I'd be curious about the history before the late 1800s and psychotherapy. Like, I'm sure the bourgeois class of Europeans had some way of talking about their issues and stuff, but I really feel like maybe Freud was an innovator in the sense of, hey, you could hire me to talk about your problems and I can help you sort that out. And this is sort of an angle I'm interested in exploring with Vince whenever we talk to him in the next episode or whatever, what meditation as a practice, how that fits into these models of psychotherapy and self-help and developing ourselves psychologically as individual human beings. But yeah, I do think that is the way it unfolded, but
Yeah.
I studied literature, so I'm not an expert. I just kind of bounced around to different sub-interests and read things here and there. So definitely not an expert take, but that's my understanding of it.
And what's interesting about that to me, and why I kind of go down that road, is like, maybe this isn't a parallel that really can be drawn, but for some reason I'm drawing it. And it's like, if this really did start with Freud and just figuring this out and really just trying to like dig into people's minds, right? And say like, okay, well, now let's think about it from a group level. It's almost like, we didn't really understand a lot of things at the time. We were just fucking around and like experimenting and like seeing like what impacts, especially when you get into like the next episode with Anna Freud and talking about like the treatments and whatnot. We're learning on the fly with this new thing that has the power to significantly impact masses of people when it's employed in a certain way, right? And I think about artificial intelligence. Are we at a similar like evolutional stage where right now we're using this thing in a way to influence all these people because we don't yet know how bad this is going to be or what the impacts could be from it? Does that make sense what I'm trying to draw there? Let me try a different way to explain it. If we think about psychoanalysis as a technology and the stages of that technology, right? And we compare that to like artificial intelligence as a technology in the different stages and where we're using it. At that point, when they were thinking about it from how do we control the masses with this new technology or these new, things that we're learning about how the mind works, and then they employ these things and it turns out like, oh, that actually fucks up a whole like generation of people, or like it creates this group of people that are now just thinking about consumerism, right? Like where we are, right? We're seeing the impacts of a lot of these techniques being employed, I guess is what I'm saying. And what I'm thinking about when it comes to like artificial intelligence, like, are we at a similar evolutional standpoint where we're using this thing without understanding all of the impacts this is going to have or could have in a similar way? Does that make more sense in the way that I'm thinking about this?
Yeah, we don't know like the ramifications of the AI tech and how it will influence and like be commodified. We're at like the burgeoning stage of it like being used as like maybe a weapon, and maybe it's selling things. We don't really know the effects of like a generational effect. Yeah, I don't know, negative. And it could be horrible. Like I don't know. I don't even want to think about the uses of AI. Like I just want to flush it down the toilet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's like what I'm thinking is like the first thing that we go towards is like, how do we use this technology to influence and control, I guess, right? And if that's where psychoanalysis is starting to develop, like what could we use it for good? In this case, what are we using it for is like, how do we control, right? Like, I guess that's the parallel I'm trying to draw here, right? Like it's as they were realizing the power of this capability for psychoanalysis, corporations are like, well, how do we use this to, sell more and control? And like, that just seems to be the undercurrent of all this new technology every time it comes up, right? Maybe 20 years down the road, we'll be like, oh, here's all the bad things. Let's avoid that. But at the, right now we're at that kind of cusp of how do we use for, profit and control first with this thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm not in the right theory, but.
No, I totally understand what you're saying. Like, yeah, that's the consistent problem we run into in this culture in which we're stuck. Like David Graeber and Wingrove said, we're stuck in this capitalist colonial mindset where the whole purpose from the point of view of the people in charge is to acquire more resources and to control more labor so as to produce more profit, more power, more control. And so any new technology that gets created, any new model of human psychology that gets created that seems useful is going to get used. And it's not a matter of like, are we aware of the downsides or not? The people who have that point of view don't care about the downsides. They're going to ignore the downsides every time in favor of the profit. That's always the problem in this model that we're stuck in. I guess the issue I was trying to work out that I couldn't figure out is that, yeah, I guess psychoanalysis could be thought of as a technology. I think of it as like a model for consciousness that has some explanatory power, but also has some significant drawbacks. It kind of, yeah, plenty of people have pointed out the drawbacks of the Freudian model, but AI, I'm not sure how AI maps onto this framework as like a model for human consciousness. You know what I mean? So I guess that's kind of where I was getting stuck. I do have a couple of things that are really just terms that kind of flip around that I picked up on while I was listening to the first episode. So the American citizen is one term, and American democracy is sort of a parallel term. So the American citizen and American democracy. And then underneath those, as sort of paired together with those, would be the American consumer and the American corporation. So what is the difference between a citizen and a consumer in this, from Bernays' point of view, we might ask? What's the difference between a citizen and a consumer, and the difference between a democracy and a corporation from Bernays' point of view?
Yeah, I guess for a citizen, Bernays would likely think, citizens are political actors, right? And they participate in kind of like a public life, and that they have a collective identity of sorts. And democracy would be about group group decision making, I guess. For Bernays, do you think?
think he, I think he too would, I don't know if he would look at them as any different from each other. Like, or I don't think he would want others to interpret them as different from each other. I think he would want others to interpret them
Oh,
as
interesting.
being the same, right? Like for a consumer and a citizen, like those should be hand in hand. And for democracy and for, I wouldn't say a corporation, I would say, but democracy and capitalism, right? Like just in general. I guess it's whatever,
Yeah.
semantics at that point.
Like
But
they, yeah.
yeah,
No, yeah, I was just
yeah,
gonna say, like, I totally think that you're right. Like, you're kind of like purchasing, being a consumer, whatever you're purchasing as an American consumer, and as a whatever citizen you're purchasing, like, yeah, your candidate. And I guess, yeah, totally. Like, corporations are mass producing ideology to sell, and that could be the same for American democracy.
yeah. Like that is that's the vision of you identifying with Adidas because you love Adidas clothing or shoes, right? Like
Yeah.
that would be the ideal if like everybody walking around was like, man, I am an Adidas American, or something like that, right? That kind of thought process.
The Nike Adidas Civil War. They would love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know, the more I was thinking about this and listening to the documentary, I started to feel like this isn't the first time this has happened. Like somebody's done Bernays' technique, and I think I've read this before on the podcast, probably. It's the beginning of chapter 4 of the Howard Zinn U.S. People's History of the U.S. It's just about the Revolution. So the first, see if this sounds familiar vis-a-vis Bernays. Okay, this strategy. This is Howard Zinn. Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from favorites of the British Empire. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new privileged leadership. When we look at the American Revolution in this way, it was a work of genius, and the Founding Fathers deserve the awed tribute they have received over the centuries. They created the most effective system of national control devised in modern times, and showed future generations of leaders the advantages of combining paternalism with command. So as a strategy, does this not sound like a similar kind of mass manipulation of people's feelings in that precise moment in history? Like, I don't know, the technique
Yeah.
just sounded exactly like what Bernays is trying to do.
Yeah. It and the but it, so like the other thing about this that I think about is like the Bernays technique isn't inherently like isn't bad by itself is what I would say. Like it's like just the way that he thinks about like how to influence could be used for things that are positive. In fact, that's how he learned it with like World War One, right? Well, depending, whatever. I'm not going to get into like was all the the geopolitics at the time, but by arguing that democracy and the ideals of democracy, not what American democracy necessarily was, but what the ideals were that we say it should be, promoting that like through the same techniques, right? That patriotism, ultranationalism, like whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I think it's the same technique. It hadn't probably just been named, or it might have been at the time. Bernays was just better at propaganda and getting his name on stuff. I don't know. I could take it from other people, but yeah, I totally agree. It's a lot of the same elements for sure.
Yeah, there's got to be a rich history of using other people's ideas here. I thought, like, Another one was in Communist Manifesto, or maybe it's like Capital or something. Marx writes about like commodity fetishism or something, and he talks about how like this exact thing happens. Like a product is a desired symbol and it relates to like social status and it has its own value, and so it's like symbolic meaning of like, freedom, like we all got with the Sydney Sweeney jeans and denim ad. It's like, America. And I thought like Bernays is just a guy who read Capital and like mistook, Marx, and just started like poaching all these ideas, and it just totally propagated this, consumerism hell. I don't know. Marx also says like something interesting I thought about during this part is how like when you create the context, like Joe, you were talking about how post World War II you have like a lawn and a suburban area, and that kind of like rise of like strip mall and suburbia like creates consumerism because you're born into that environment. And yesterday we were watching TV and there was an ad for children credit cards, and I thought, no, they're starting too young. Anyway, sorry for the tangent.
No, that's a great point and a great parallel too. Like the same way that Bernays has kind of taken Freud's model and turning it towards a capitalist purpose. A shrewd capitalist would do well to read volume one of Capital, if not all three, and take notes and produce their surplus value accordingly. Marx lays it all out, all the different ways you can manipulate human labor and resources to produce more surplus value. He explains how the capitalists do it. And if you really wanted to know how to do it, you could read his stuff and do it. But that would, kind of be a perversion or an inversion of the original person's intent.
Yeah, so kind of close out the first episode after watching that. I didn't mention it up front. I did want to read the quote from Bernays. And it basically says, when I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because the Germans using it, and so I had to find some other words. So we founded the Council on Public Relations. Right back to what you were saying, Joe. It's synonymous. It's the same thing from the mouth of the person that created it. So, we talked about the mob in the streets mentality that some people were talking about and how to control that. And Bernays really thought via public relations that he could control, everyone's actions based off the what he's been created, which is, Joe, goes right back to people that think that, right? We should probably study, why that is. But after Hoover got elected, he actually agreed with Bernays' focus, according to the doc. The way it was talking about it was basically focus on turning Americans into consumers, which gives us the title of this episode, which is happiness machines. Basically thought if they could keep people entertained and consuming on this cycle, that they would be happy, easy to control. I think the quote that a lot of people hear is, bread and circuses or something like that, like keep people fed and entertained. Maybe I'm misquoting that, but that's essentially the view that, Hoover agreed with, that could be done through working with the different corporations. I did think at the end that the 1920 crash that it kind of hit into was a little too, I don't know, real for me in the current situation we're in right now. Like, I don't know. It's like, are you describing, the 2020s or the 1920s, and then rise of, Nazi Germany on the promise of the destruction of democracy, right? Like those two things back to back were good. But yeah, just to close it out, I'm going to play the last portion here. It's not quite the last portion. It's around 48 minutes. And this is when they actually talk about that piece with Hoover and the mindset that people had. So let me just play this really quick for you guys.
America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, A campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being used on a grand scale. I mean, totally.
The General Motors Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and byroads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry, showing...
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
Better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes.
I just thought that was a good kind of tie in there for a lot of the concepts that we were talking about. I let it play a little longer just because I think the fact that the government was actually putting out messages and messaging on like big business and manipulation of media. I don't know. Can you guys imagine like when we might actually get something like that from our government again? It'll be interesting, but yeah, just wanted to play that one as a kind of a closeout for the first episode anyway.
Yeah, I'm not much on predictive history, but you were sort of pairing the 1920s with the 2020s, and then your question just now, when all the bubbles are about to burst and things kind of seem haywire, that's really when you might get a very different approach very soon. Like the days when we see government putting out their own counter-capitalist propaganda might come sooner than you think, depending on how things are moving. Just kind of seems like the times are ripe for a lot of chaos, a lot of spontaneous things to happen. It's really unpredictable, which creates a situation where just about anything is possible. You know, the Zoran Mamdanis or World War III, which is basically already here. Like, if you count up all the people that are dying or displaced or being bombed right now across the world, incredibly hard to argue that it's not World War III already.
But what I'm hearing is that there's hope there that while conditions right now are not great, it could be the catalyst that we need to have a second New Deal that focuses on people in the United States or something like that. And maybe this one doesn't have all the errors that we read about in the last, what was the one when affirmative action was white, right? Maybe we can take some less history from that.
Yeah, one thing I would note that I saw in the news this week or the previous week, Dropsite News had paired up with Zeteo, which is another news organization run by Mehdi Hassan, and some other group I can't remember the name of. I think it was a polling agency, but they funded this mass poll of American public opinion on a bunch of different things. And the statistics I wanna bring out, I think it was in general 52% or higher among Democrats. It was like 80-something%. Independents, it was like 70%. Republicans, it was even like 30%. But the question was essentially, do you think that the Trump administration started the war with Iran in order to cover up the Jeffrey Epstein scandal? And a shockingly large number of the general public believes that it did. And the reason it's significant is not because it feels significant to us. We're living in this moment. That feels like the obvious response to us who are living in it. But when you look back at these historical moments, like the launch of the Iraq War in 2003, even Vietnam or Korea when they first started, before all the news about the atrocities came out, when a war starts, when a commander-in-chief starts a new war, historically, immediately they get a ton of support. There's a ton of patriotic support for the start of that war. And this is like one of the first historical moments where from the outset, nobody trusts it. And I think that's a huge shift in public opinion that's worth taking note of, given everything that we're saying.
I agree. And actually, it made me think about The techniques that people talk about when we're talking about disinformation in order to kind of combat that is this concept of pre-bunking, or basically putting out information beforehand that, like, hey, this is likely to happen, and or this is, the real story prior to. It's actually something that I think the US government did pretty well in the early days of the Ukraine war. Like, they were putting out intel on Russia's going to do this in the next day, and then they went and did it, right? Like, so that was like a hey, whatever story they're going to put out, like, we already have the truth out there. And I wonder, for this war in Iran, if Trump almost did that to himself by all of his Iran whoever's going to go to war with Iran, or they're going to do war in Iran as a distraction. Like, he almost pre-bunked himself, like telling on himself, right? So like, whatever boost he could have gotten, like, he already wasted all of that just through his own actions. I feel like, is that kind of what you're saying there?
Maybe. I'm thinking about it less in terms of like how Trump has sort of tripped himself up and sort of made some faux pas that now are coming back to bite him. I'm thinking more in terms of mass media, social media, and this sort of accretion of social awareness over time, and how the longer the longer that the masses have access to things like social media, where we can immediately see evidence of what's going on around the world in real time, the more that that access is distributed and consumed, the less likely it is to have some super simple propaganda narrative succeed at a mass scale. People are going to see through it immediately because they have access to the information immediately. And so by pursuing these technologies relentlessly, they've sort of given away the keys to the kingdom. Like, we all can sort of see everything. It's harder to manipulate us. We are still manipulated, like propaganda's all around us, but it's so saturated and so diverse, right? There are all these little niches and corners and pockets, and it's hard to get a consistently manipulated narrative across all these populations at once. And I think they're kind of frantically scrambling and trying to use AI to figure out the problem. But I think they don't really know how to manipulate the masses on a large scale anymore. I think that's increasingly hard for them to do. And that's kind of the significance of the statistic for me, is that the general public already, as a rule, kind of distrusts the elite. Whether it's corporations or the government, people who have that level of power, we, as a rule, basically don't trust those people. Or the ones that we do trust have to do a lot to earn that trust.
That's super. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, social media has made like live events like known. Like, I learned about the Iranian schoolgirls bombing like as it was happening. Like, I was reading it on Reddit, whatever, and there's like a live thread and people are talking about it live. And same with like World Central Kitchen when Israel bombed that in Palestine. Like, it was like a day later I read like this total slant on it from, some state media. So it's totally like a delayed thing. But the trouble there is, like, we have these AI videos. So if you're on social media, it's like, yeah, you can totally get the truth. You could get AI, and that's why I think you both like highlighted so well that like literacy there is so important, and that's really what we got to teach people, is how to discern between all that.
This is one of those areas where I think the getting pedantic about the terminology is actually helpful when it comes to like propaganda versus disinformation, and recognizing these as two different things. Because I think the scenario that we're talking about, right? Propaganda works really well, and it's easy when you have a clear narrative, and also, I would say, like, something like the ideals of democracy, which are broadly like supported, right? Like, people would want, their voice to matter, right? That makes the narrative easier to push and to continue to stay on. But in this situation where it's like, well, there's, no one's going to be really happy about what we're actually doing, disinformation and flooding the zone tactics and just trying to make it confusing and hard to understand. Like, I think that's why there's the rise in that, because they don't have that consistent narrative that they can push that people would really want to see, because that was MAGA, and that's falling apart. Like, it's at this point, like, that is starting to fracture that whatever narrative they had there, war in Iran, right? No more foreign wars. Like, so I think that's why we're going to continue to see a rise in disinformation tactics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I like that take, because it's like, what I hear you saying is that when propaganda, i.e. mass manipulation of a large group of people with a consistent narrative, when that's not possible, the next step is just mass confusion. Throw shit everywhere, confuse the airwaves, put all kinds of conflicting messages out there, just make everything uncertain.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree that that's kind of the move they're going for now. I also think it's a bad call on their part. I think they underestimate a sort of basic intuitive literacy people have, especially people in our generation or younger who've grown up with these technologies, and it's kind of like just the water we live in. These young audiences are way more savvy viewers than the older generations they're used to manipulating. There's not that immediate trust of institutions and powerful people. There's an immediate distrust of them. Yeah, like I don't know. I think South Park did a bit on this where they had, I don't know. I don't watch a lot of South Park. It was one of the random ones that I caught, but it was like they had hired some teenagers to read a bunch of articles that were supposed to be news articles and to tell them whether or not it was an ad. And the teenagers were immediately like, yeah, ad, ad, ad. But the older people had a much harder time pointing out when it was an ad. And I think it's kind of the same phenomenon I'm trying to describe.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And I think you're totally right, Cody. Like I don't know if they actually do know how to manipulate as well as they're saying they do. And I think it leads them to make like total mistakes. And it's also like why they're absorbing everything. Like the Ellisons are like, they got to buy TikTok, they got to buy Warner Brothers, HBO, Paramount. Like now it's like there's like an EA deal with the Kushners and this, and they're all just like, so intertwined. They're just trying to buy everything because if they own everything, then they can't doubt it. But I think like, yeah, the literacy of the younger generation and isn't there like a mentality in society that we all have? Like, we all left MySpace, right? Like if something happens like that, like Ellison's take over TikTok, like see ya. And then like a new one comes up and it's from the people and maybe more trustworthy.
Actually, the documentary, I think, highlights something else why maybe this doesn't work here. Like it was interesting because it talked about Germany, and there was a lot of the parallels that I was seeing in that episode. It was like taking control of business and organizing and giving into like the aggressive desires of a population and actually encouraging that, right? Like you see all that because they thought they could kind of control it and direct that. And in this scenario, there's a rise of thinking about oneself as an individual in the United States in order to promote consumerism and like, rugged individualism is a thing. And now like they're trying to shift that to more of a control, like I want to control the population structure. And it's like, is that innate thing that you built into people going to make them less responsive to this new type of government that you want to put in place? Like, have you created the person that's going to fight back accidentally? I don't know. That's kind of one of the things I was thinking about.
Yeah, I like that idea. I don't know if you want to just keep rolling into the second episode stuff, but this does feel like thematically we're already kind of touching on some of the stuff, like yeah, what the difference between individuality and development as an individual psychologically, and then identifying with a group and what does it mean to develop psychologically as a group. I think those are different axes of development, but I think as human beings, we're naturally inclined to want both of those things. We want to develop as individuals psychologically. We want to understand ourselves and to grow. And we also want to feel connected to communities that feel meaningful. And we want to grow collectively as communities. And so we are susceptible to having those desires manipulated. Like that's why you can manipulate in a mob mentality way. And that's really what I'm excited to talk to Vince about, because I think meditation is a way to kind of work on these different points of view in a very intentional, practical way to give individuals the skills to not only develop themselves individually, but also to feel connected to a group, to find their people, to develop in that way. And it kind of undercuts, the typical institution we would rely on for those things, where you'd have to pay money to go see a therapist, which is something people should do. Like if you need talk therapy, you should have a therapist, but it costs money, right? If you don't have insurance, it costs money. Meditation is something you can just kind of sit and do with yourself. And then with communities, with group identities, it's either buying shit to identify with a brand, or it's signing up for a $200 a month CrossFit membership so you could have some friends you work out with together. No offense to CrossFit people. I've joined a CrossFit gym before. I'm not shitting on that. But there are these different ways we find community, and so many of them require consumerism. People online, especially on TikTok, people have been talking about culture and stuff, talk about the absence of third spaces, right? We have our home, which is one space, and we have other places where we have to spend money to be there, basically. And the availability of third spaces like public parks and public libraries and things like that, those are harder to access, harder to enjoy, less maintenance is going on. They're trying to pigeonhole us either staying at home or going out and buying shit. And there have to be ways to develop those third spaces where we can connect with communities in a meaningful way without having to, buy stuff, I guess. I don't know. I feel like I'm trailing the thought up there, but those two different things I kind of wanted to play with.
I was just thinking about like how do you go without buying stuff? Like, is there I was just thinking about like community organizing. Is there like a fun fund? Like, you know what I mean? Like, just like, I mean, one of the things that the AVSC folks do is they'll do like it's just kind of like a potluck, bring whatever, bring drinks and come in and have a social hour. But they still need to pay for the building. Someone needs to get money. Like, money is still needs to exchange hands in order to even have that space. Yeah. So it's difficult unless you have
That's an important point.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, just to sort of, yeah, on that line, I think like you were saying with terms earlier, it's important to be specific. And like money is a resource that represents exchange value. You can take money and you can exchange it for goods, and it's useful in that way. And we can still use money in practical ways as small groups and communities like that. If someone wants to organize and host the potluck, other people have to provide food. People who can't cook or aren't able to provide food can provide some money to support the people who are cooking the food. There's a way to sort of include money as a tool in the overall organizing scheme at the community level. But there's a difference between that and like capitalism per se, where profit and surplus value are the point, right? There, you can do a potluck without trying to generate surplus value, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yep, that makes sense. Jumping more into episode 2, Engineering of Consent. I don't know if you guys have any big takeaways on that. One thing that kind of stuck out to me that was really interesting to me, and we already kind of talked about this some, but was just the history of psychoanalysis into that. And like when it started with the interviews with the soldiers and like seeing that one guy, like, no one's asked me questions, like, and just like that whole thing, it really honestly like contextualized a bunch of Hollywood movie scenes that I really wouldn't have connected before. Like there's like actual videos of these types of interviews occurring that are often satirized or just used as some explanation point there. But that was kind of an interesting thing to me. It also made me feel like, going back to what we were just talking about, it's like, with that, it makes sense why some people might have a distrust of therapists from older generations, if like that was kind of the introduction a little bit there. But yeah, anything from you guys just in general?
The only thing that stuck out to me, or that's like standing out in my notes, is I guess I was playing with the two different points of view in both episodes. Like I compared Freud's one-to-one patient doctor point of view with the mass manipulation point of view, the elite figure who wants to manipulate the masses. And with the second episode, it kind of seemed like a parallel difference between two points of view, with Anna Freud sort of representing the one-to-one psychologist, and then this other figure, Ernest Dichter, who created the focus group and sort of used focus group research as fodder for corporations to strategize ways to manipulate consumers. And so those two different points of view stood out to me in the second episode.
Yeah, I think too about like was it like Lippmann and the simplification of like democracy, and like how to like simplify the images of like reality and organize information to the public, because we're all just dumb-dumps apparently, and that kind of stuff, I guess.
I think the big and some of the takeaways of the analysis too that they had was that we need to suppress or entertain people away from their internal irrational selves. Like, so they're like not thinking about that. Like,
The irrational self thing got me, and I can't really remember too much about Freud, but like the idea of like I don't know, there's just a lot of sexual stuff with Freud, so I kind of like threw it out the window, I guess, in college. But the irrational self, that whole ideology of like that being a driving factor, I think was just kind of it's always stood out as like a shocking thing of like that's the history of psychology is that we're all irrational creatures. Like it sounds just like the Leviathan, Rousseau, Hobbes kind of thing. Like you're all irrational and you really need us, and I'm going to tell you why. It's like,
Yeah, I totally have a similar frustration with the Freudian model. It's like, I don't know, models are good to the extent that they can explain things that have already happened and to the extent that they can predict things that haven't happened. And you could look at models in any domain and ask that same question, like a standard model for the universe with science. Like, how predictive is it? How well does it predict phenomena in the universe? And when it fails to predict things, then you have problems with the model. And that's what sort of quantum science is figuring out right now with the standard model and everything. But with Freud, yeah, the model kind of leans on this assumption that there are unconscious libidinal forces that drive our behaviors in ways that we aren't always aware of, and that the dream world is the access point for getting information out of the unconscious. And so psychoanalysts are extremely interested in the content of your dreams because your conscious mind isn't getting in the way of that content. And to the extent that you can relate your dreams accurately, the therapist can get a lot of information about what's going on with you unconsciously. And I think my frustration with that has to do with the fact that the context we live in, the world that's built around us. I mean, Arthur, you were talking about suburbia earlier and how that environment constructs consumerist behavior almost as a default with the strip malls and everything. That context that we grow up in and we live in, that determines our unconscious content to a great deal. Like we do inherit DNA, we do inherit things genetically, like trauma is genetically inherited in some cases that people have found out, especially with people who are descended from former slaves and things like that. There is an inheritance of genetic trauma. But at the same time, our built environments determine our unconscious content. The media we consume every day determines our unconscious content. And so that's kind of my frustration with the Freudian model is like, can we address that side of it? Can we address how society is built, how it's structured? Can we make changes there instead of just putting it on individuals to figure out their shit by studying their dreams? Like maybe you can make some progress that way, and you should if you have the means to do so. But also collectively, can we have a conversation about how to build better environments that create better unconscious content to begin with? If that makes sense.
Is there a big psychoanalyst industrial complex? It's like, we got to keep people fucked up because we earn money. Can't address those root causes. Like, serious answer to that. What it made me think about what you're saying is almost like the parallel of we put like saving the world and the environment on an individual through your choices and recycling and whatnot. And it's like, there are some other things that we could structurally do with our society that could have a larger impact on this.
definitely. Like you think about like, you know, in my head, I wake up and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be driving my gas guzzling machine. Meanwhile, it's like one bomb dropped and it's like, well, that equates 20 million for the rest of my life. Like, never gonna do that.
Yeah, I always thought it was alarming that, like, I remember learning a long time ago, maybe I was still in the military when I learned this, but the Department of Defense had put out some information about climate change, and they were very transparently pointing out that climate change was perhaps the biggest threat to national security, because that's their point of view is national security. And that because of all these changes in the climate and migration being inevitable on a mass scale, that's going to create national security risks and everything. At the same time, the U.S. Department of Defense is perhaps the biggest polluter in the world. There have been like whistleblowers on Navy ships who've posted videos online who've said like, it's literally my job at night to dump the trash off the back of the ship, to just dump the trash off the back of the ship while we're going. We just dump our trash in the ocean while we're going on a Navy cruiser. Like, and that's just like the polluting side of it. That doesn't even include the bombs and the gas and all the other things. But yeah.
Yeah. And the For part two, like, I guess, like, the other thing that was in my head is how they kind of view these tools as, like, politically neutral. Like, they work in democracy, they work in consumerism and corporate advertising, they work in, like, authoritarian regimes. Like, they're just tools, I guess, that they're using. And I knew about the politics, obviously, of, like, the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and the coup, but I had no idea that this guy, like, before that even happened, was like doing the PR campaign for it. So that was just kind of alarming and shows how, I don't know, yeah, I guess like people do start conversations in private rooms, business interests, and they see how far out it goes.
His his reach and like what he was involved in is kind of incredible, especially considering like I love the he goes through the fall of the stock market crash and everyone realizing like I think the quote in there was like, oh, maybe you shouldn't just let laissez-faire capitalism run rampant. Like, that doesn't work well. But then comes back, right? And is still like in these influential circles and brings himself back up. And those specific tactics, right, that you mentioned, like we can see them all throughout, like once you kind of spot it, right, like the emotional appeal, making sure that you're always pulling in, you're not using logic, you're using emotion, you're making that the core of your argument. And then like the third party authority stuff, like him starting that with like a bunch of doctors say you should do X, right, like you trust this institution. Staging events you could think of as the new viral, what did people do to go viral, right? Like that's what the Torches of Freedom was, right? Like that's a precursor to that. And then astroturfing, front groups, things of that nature, getting people to go and say things on your behalf. Like what are bot networks, if not exactly that today, right? Like you can see that through line for each one of these techniques that they're just continuing to be used, like you said, for good or bad. It seems like we're mostly talking about the bad because that's what we're really concerned about, but I'd be interested in the good as well, I guess.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I just thought of the Kendall Jenner like Pepsi ad after the George Floyd protest, or whatever. Like there's always just these like crazy capitalism ads, just like we'll heal the nation.
They look at themselves as the heart, right? Like that's gotta, like, I mean, in a lot of ways, is it not like the way that American society is set up? Is it not the core of it at
Yeah.
the moment? Like, is that, I mean, we talk about the economy and like, oh, the Dow and all this stuff. We talk about that like that is America or some sort of measure of how well our country's doing, like, which economically, sure. But like, I mean, that literally is it.
Yeah. Meanwhile, their taxes are big fat zero. They're like hoarding the private money, and public goods like streets, parks, schools are just at like, all-time lows. It's interesting how they use that psychology and really they just hoard it all.
Yeah. Yeah, we're talking about like you're saying, the stock market is often given as like a synonymous thing with how the country is doing. And if you're lucky enough to still have a pension, maybe that does have something to do with how well your pension is doing. But most people in our generation and younger don't have that luxury. We're not on pensions or anything. But affordability is more about how the country is doing. Like, what are the basic costs of goods, food, housing, transportation? And people have done cost analysis on just like what a one-bedroom apartment costs in 2019 versus 2026. And it's almost double in most places. Like the cost of living as just getting by week, paying your rent, paying your mortgage, buying food, all that stuff costs way more than it used to, even just 6, 7 years ago. And wages are what? Isn't federal minimum wage still $7.25 after all these years?
It's gone up $2
That's not
in my
part of the
lifetime.
conversation.
Like, I think it was $5.25 when I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah. My first official job was at Subway, and I made $5.05 an hour.
Wealth concentration, all-time high, tax. I can't believe the laws of the minimum wage either. And like in some states, it's like they offset it. Like Cheyenne was telling me in Oklahoma, you're a waitress and it's like, they'll pay you whatever, but your tip subsidize that. And it's the same now for like Grubhub and DoorDash. Like your tip can be applied to their hourly rate, and then like the corporations don't have to pay them the hourly rate because you're subsidizing. It's like, what
Yeah.
are the laws? That's crazy.
We should outlaw tipping in the United States and force corporations to pay like an actual reasonable wage like they do in Europe. You shouldn't have to survive on other people's charity, which is really
Absolutely.
what tipping is.
The service industry is just a massive industry of abused workers all over the place, for sure. Especially women who are serving, like a lot of young women and girls, teenage girls and young women get jobs as servers at restaurants as like a first job. All the sexual assault and harassment they have to put up with from customers and staff, all the wage theft they have to put up with, like somebody walks out on your tab and then your manager is like, oh, well, now you owe me that money. It happens all the time, and they're just powerless to do anything about it in most cases.
I just have one clip that I want to share that's closer to the end, that's kind of a rebuttal of this whole belief of how psychoanalysis should be used, that I thought was, I was glad they put it in, because it was like at least somebody was thinking about that maybe this isn't a good idea to how to use this this new information we're learning. But let me share this real quick.
The critics included Monroe's ex-husband, Arthur Miller.
My argument with so much psychoanalysis is the preconception that suffering is a mistake, or a sign of weakness, or a sign even of illness, when in fact, possibly the greatest truths we know have come out of people's suffering. That the problem is not to undo suffering or to wipe it off the face of the earth, but to make it inform our lives, instead of trying to cure ourselves of it constantly and avoid it, and avoid anything but that lobotomized sense of what they call happiness. There's too much of an attempt, it seems to me, to think in terms of controlling man rather than freeing him, of defining him rather than letting him go. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the whole ideology of this age, which is power mad.
Hey, have you heard about the crazy new way to send a message today? It's flashed on a screen, too quick to see, but still you get it subliminally.
At the same time, an onslaught was launched on the way psychoanalysis was being used by business to control people. The first blow came with a bestseller, The Hidden Persuaders, written by Vance Packard. It accused psychoanalysts of reducing the American people to emotional puppets whose only function was to keep the mass production lines running. They did this by manipulating people's unconscious desires to create longings for ever new brands and models. They had turned the population into unwitting participants in the system of planned obsolescence. The second blow came from an influential philosopher and social critic, Herbert Marcuse. He had been trained in psychoanalysis.
This is a childish application of psychoanalysis, which does not take at all into consideration the very real political, systematic waste of resources, of technology, and of the productive process. For example, planned obsolescence. For example, the production of innumerable brands and gadgets who are, in the last analysis, all the same. The production of innumerable different marks of automobiles. And this prosperity at the same time, consciously or unconsciously, leads to a kind of schizophrenic existence, I believe.
Really, I thought we've probably already talked about, most of that, but I think that kind of wraps into, the conversations we've been having so far about this chapter. And I liked the main thing from the first one is just that, my takeaway anyway was we should be learning from our suffering, like not only individually, but as like a culture, society, as the history of people. We shouldn't be trying to just numb everything out or ignore it and only think about the good things. We should learn from it. And then I just really like the takedown of like this use of I was like, it's a childish use, right? Like, and again, this makes me think back to like AI, childish uses of these really powerful things that could influence, right? Like, so anyway, that was my thought for those two pieces there.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that Arthur Miller bit, because I'd written down that quote from him too about suffering. Thought it was really, really wise and important, because a lot of the whole Freudian model of psychoanalysis is intended to address suffering that people have. Like there were people displaying extreme psychological distress and suffering, and they wanted to find a way to address it. And there's the talk therapy model that addresses the suffering, and then there's the consumerist model. It's like, hey, you buy this shit, it'll make you happy, and therefore you're not suffering. And I liked Arthur Miller's take. It's that like suffering is a lesson. It's an experience. It's on the one hand inevitable. The fact that you're born means you're going to die someday, which in and of itself is a moment of suffering. So no matter how good your life is, at a certain point there's going to come suffering. And so there has to be a kind of skillfulness. There are different perspectives with which we can view our own suffering. And for me, what I find valuable about meditation and stuff is the ability to practice different perspectives of different ways of looking at your own experience and different ways of looking at the experience of others. And so you put on a new way of looking and you ask yourself, how does this new way of looking change my perception of that experience? Does it feel better? Does it feel worse? Does it feel like I understand more? Does it feel like I understand less? Let me try on a new way of perceiving it and see what that does. And that's kind of how I like to work with suffering. It's not something that you can just make go away. It's something that's coming eventually, always. And the question is, how do you relate to it? How do you experience it? Repression is a very common tactic, just to stuff it down and pretend it doesn't exist. But Freud's famous line, the return of the repressed, it always comes back at some point. So there's that you have to deal with. And yeah, how do we experience our suffering in a way that's healthy and useful for ourselves and others? I think it's an important question, but consumerism isn't the answer.
Retail therapy is commonly said, but not necessarily the most effective long-term solution.
Because we don't have enough money now. It's like the numbing out is I think it's like due in part to like, I mean, obviously due in part to the, overwhelm of like stress and economic insecurity. Like we all, you just mentioned how nearly doubled like a one bedroom, and just like the cost of living and media overuse, which like they definitely are encouraging. And so all of these are factors that they do control. There's a reason that Elon can have like $50 billion, and you can think of how many zeros that is and how much each person could, whatever. The wealth concentration is just insanity. And the other thing I was going to talk to y'all about, which I thought was interesting, was this, like, I guess suffering and like what the right way for like human flourishing is and happiness in life, because through consumerism and Christianity, it's framed as like maybe moral and, like, I guess, we get like virtue signaling and like how consumerism, can it exist and can we like participate in it while flourishing and not taking it seriously? Like, how do we do that? And it's kind of a question I wanted to ask Vince too next week, because I know Buddhism, obviously suffering is a huge part. And so philosophically, I was really interested in that. So I don't know, maybe I'll get into it more too next week with Vince.
My initial thought is like, why can't we do both? Like, I don't know, like it's I always think of like anything in moderation is fine, but it's like, where's the importance placed? What's the ultimate like thing that we're actually like doing here? Because like, I guess I relate it to, well, that's not true. The picture that I have in my head right now is like, I think there's still a world where people can create cool things that they want to sell to other people, and that's totally fine, right? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's the prioritization of profit, bottom line, that piece of it. If it's prioritizing, hey, this is the product and this is going to last you 20 years because I've made so much, like put so much into this thing, right? Like, I don't know. I don't see any issue with that. I think it's where you put the priority piece is where the problem starts for me.
I agree with you. Like the Buy It for Life subreddit, when you see people talk about like, hey, look at this washing machine that's still kicking from 70 years ago. And then like, I bought one 2 years ago that's broken because the smart, devices aren't working. So I totally see that.
I don't really have too much more on this specific one. I guess I did just want to mention, Howard Hunt shows up at 36 minutes and 30 seconds. If you don't know who Howard Hunt is, you should definitely look at his Wikipedia page, because it reads like a weird like Tom Clancy spy novel. Or go watch the White House Plumbers on HBO. It stars Woody Harrelson as Howard Hunt in this, because Howard Hunt was also one of the guys that broke in for Watergate. Like there's so much like things that he's been involved in. It's kind of insane. But yeah, of course they had him for this to interview him here. But yeah, go watch White House Plumbers. Woody Harrelson, you'll get more on Howard Hunt. Justin Theroux plays G. Gordon Liddy, who is just an absolutely insane character, real person. But White House Plumbers, if you watch that, and then also I'll plug another episode for Behind the Bastards here. They do a few parter on G. Gordon Liddy. Just crazy that this is a real person that worked in our government at some point. But yeah, he's just fantastic in it. So that's my only other plug that I wanted to mention here before we I think we've got one more piece to play to close out. So
yeah, I was just going to tie it back to this problem of suffering, like the real acknowledgement that it exists and that the world that's been built around us makes it a lot worse. Like capitalism and colonialism and all these forces make suffering a lot worse than it has to be. And so we have real big social questions that need to be answered and problems that need to be addressed, but we're not going to address them or solve them by ignoring the suffering that exists. So if you still have that pulled up on yours and it's convenient to share, that MLK quote starts at 55 minutes, almost exactly. And so this is just going to be Martin Luther King Jr. talking about the psychological concept of maladjusted, the maladjusted individual. And I thought he had some really wise things to say about that.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
Anything that we never intend to be well adjusted to in this age? I can think of many, obviously.
Lots of things. Yeah, it was it is interesting, like to think about maladjusted to, or to who, right? I guess that's the underlying thing. To whom? Like who is making that decision and telling people, right? Like what's the thing you need to be adjusted to? Yeah, that's a really good quote.
Kind of makes me think about like the Overton window a little bit. That concept of what's politically possible, right, in a given moment, and how people who are in charge of the narrative can shift the Overton window. I mean, sometimes it's like a kind of reductive left versus right dynamic or whatever, but yeah, people have talked about how conservative politicians and lobbyists, etc., have shifted the Overton window further and further to the right over the years. And that shifting correlates to what feels normal in society. So the more that we're saturated with AI garbage, the more that we're saturated with all these insane political takes with constant wars and bombings and genocides and starvation and economic inequality and all this stuff, the more that that's the normal. And it's to your question, it's to that sense of normalcy that we are resisting being adjusted. I'm resisting accepting the feeling that all of that is normal. And that's a very hard thing to do because it is the world we see every day when we open our phones and talk to people or whatever. Like that is the quote unquote normal world, but I'm trying to make a practice of not accepting that as normal, which makes us feel kind of scattered and fragmented, and that creates mental health tensions, right, that have to be worked out. It is hard to not adjust ourselves to that normalcy, but it's nevertheless pretty urgent, I think, right now to keep clear heads about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But yeah, it's a practice. It's hard. I don't know how you guys are doing with it, but I find it quite hard most days.
Yeah, I agree. And it can make you feel alienated a bit from your baseline. It can be like family, friends, whatever. But to reject like some of the things that people take to be normal, we'll just say, yeah, it can be hard. It creates that divide.
I think it was after, or it wasn't after the election, but before Trump got elected this last time. I think there was some polling out there regarding, do people think he was too extreme or like didn't show like proper political deference or wasn't, like the stuff like that. Like does he act like a politician or should and older generations were like, yeah, he's completely out there, right? Like no politician would do this. But younger generations didn't see his behavior as that different than what they would expect because that's what they grew up with, like with him being crazy, right? Like, so it's just, yeah, to your point, like for us that lived mostly through Obama, right, like as being kind of what the middle of the road was, right, like, or I guess the standard that we kind of really grew up with, and then seeing this like completely different, yeah, we wouldn't think it's the same or acceptable behavior, right? But there are generations that do now. I guess your point, Joe, about how that moves. But we can swing it back, right? That's pendulum, right?
We're praying.
That covers part 1 of our deep dive episodes discussing Adam Curtis's documentary, A Century of the Self. We will have part 2 of this conversation, which covers parts 3 and 4 of the documentary next Thursday. So that closes us out for the week. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember that propaganda loves you.